So Donald Trump thought capturing Nicolas Maduro would be a clean victory that demonstrated American power without consequences. It's honestly hard to believe he didn't see this coming because within hours of announcing the Venezuela operation, China issued its harshest condemnation of U.S. military action in decades. Russia called it armed aggression and promised consequences. And Iran warned that Washington just set a precedent that threatens every nation that opposes American hegemony. This isn't just diplomatic theater. We're talking about three nuclear-armed powers with over $60 billion invested in Venezuela, strategic military partnerships throughout Latin America, and the capability to turn the Caribbean into the next major flashpoint for global conflict. Trump's Venezuela gambit didn't end a threat, it just triggered the most dangerous geopolitical crisis in the Western Hemisphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let me fill you in on what's been happening with America's adversaries and the response to Trump's Venezuela invasion. Within hours of the Saturday, January 3rd operation that captured Maduro, China's foreign ministry issued a statement that was absolutely scathing. Beijing said it was deeply shocked and strongly condemns the U.S. for recklessly using force against a sovereign state and targeting its president. They called Trump's actions hegemonic behavior that seriously violates international law, infringes on Venezuela's sovereignty, and threatens peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean. But China didn't stop with one statement. On Sunday, January 4th, Beijing issued a second, even stronger condemnation. This time, China demanded that the United States immediately release Maduro and his wife, insisted their safety be a priority, and explicitly called on Washington to stop toppling the government of Venezuela. That language is significant. China isn't just criticizing American tactics. They're framing this as an illegal regime change operation and positioning themselves as defenders of Venezuelan sovereignty. Russia followed with its own harsh response. The Russian Foreign Ministry condemned the strikes as an act of armed aggression against Venezuela. Moscow's statement was carefully crafted to hit multiple themes. They called the U.S. pretext for attacking Venezuela unfounded, warned that the move risks further escalation, and demanded dialogue instead of military force. Russia specifically declared that Latin America must remain a zone of peace and that Venezuela must be guaranteed the right to determine its own destiny without destructive military interference from outside powers. Here's where things get really interesting. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei issued his own statement calling the U.S. operation a clear violation of international law's basic principles. Iranian officials explicitly warned that what happened to Venezuela could happen to any nation that opposes American policy. That's not just solidarity with an ally. That's Tehran recognizing that Trump has established a precedent for invading countries, capturing their leaders, and occupying their territory whenever he decides it serves us interests. Even North Korea weighed in, with their foreign ministry calling the Venezuela operation the most serious form of encroachment of sovereignty and describing it as another example that confirms the rogue and brutal nature of the United States. When Pyongyang, Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran are all issuing coordinated condemnations within hours of each other, that's not coincidence. That's a deliberate messaging campaign by authoritarian powers who see Trump's action as a direct threat to their own survival. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen China and Russia push back against U.S. actions in Latin America, but the intensity and coordination of this response is unprecedented. The pattern emerging is clear. America's adversaries view Venezuela as a test case for whether international law still constrains U.S. military power, and Trump just showed them the answer is no. Just think about China's massive investment in Venezuela over the past 2 decades. Beijing has extended over $60 billion in loans to Caracas since 2007, making Venezuela China's largest debtor. In Latin America, that's not just economic policy, that's a strategic partnership designed to give China a foothold in America's backyard and secure access to oil resources that don't depend on U.S.-controlled shipping lanes. Venezuela was China's first Spanish-speaking strategic development partner back in 2001, a relationship that has only deepened over time. China's economic exposure goes far beyond loans. Chinese refiners are the biggest buyers of Venezuelan crude oil. Officially, China hasn't imported Venezuelan oil since March 2025, but third-party shipping data indicates flows to China remained robust last year, with independent refiners known as teapots purchasing heavy Mire crude used to make bitumen for road construction. Venezuelan oil shipments to China averaged over 600,000 barrels per day in December 2025, constituting about 4% of China's total oil imports. That might sound small, but it represents a crucial supply line that bypasses U.S. sanctions and demonstrates China's ability to operate outside American financial systems. Then there's Russia's deep military partnership with Venezuela. Moscow has supplied Venezuela with Su-30 Mk-2 fighter jets, signed contracts for 100,000 AK-103 assault rifles, approved a $2 billion loan in 2009, and deployed nuclear-capable warships and submarines to the Caribbean for joint exercises. In November 2025, just weeks before Trump's operation, Russia slammed excessive U.S. military force in the Caribbean and backed Venezuela's government while considering additional military aid to Caracas. Russia formalized its alignment with Venezuela through a strategic partnership treaty signed in May 2025, institutionalizing cooperation across defense, energy, sanctions evasion, and technology. And let's not forget Iran's role in propping up the Maduro regime. Tehran has been exporting oil to Venezuela since 2022, sending refined fuel, parts, and expertise to bolster Venezuela's collapsing oil industry in exchange for financial support. Iran and Venezuela have also collaborated on military cooperation, with Caracas purchasing Iranian drones and other weaponry. For Iran, Venezuela represents a rare success story of sanctions evasion and a demonstration that countries can survive U.S. maximum pressure campaigns if they have determined partners willing to ignore American restrictions. The military connections between Russia and Venezuela specifically are deeply concerning from a U.S. security perspective. Moscow deployed nuclear-capable warships, including the Peter the Great, to the Caribbean for naval exercises, sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in 2018, and has consistently used military deployments to the Western Hemisphere. As geopolitical responses to perceived U.S. escalations, Russian military delegations have appeared at Venezuela's Independence Day parades. Venezuelan cadets have studied at Russia's elite Tyumen Higher Military Engineer Command school specializing in drones and robotic systems, and Russia has sponsored international army games that Venezuela hosted, including the Sniper Frontier 2022 competition. Now, here's where Trump's operation creates maximum danger. So, what did Trump do that triggered this unprecedented coordinated response from China, Russia, and Iran? Well, it all boils down to Trump unilaterally demonstrating that the United States will use overwhelming military force to remove any government in the Western Hemisphere that cultivates ties with American adversaries, regardless of international law, congressional authorization, or alliance consultation. The situation is explosive because these three powers, China, Russia, and Iran, have invested decades building relationships throughout Latin America specifically to counter U.S. influence. They've poured hundreds of billions into loans, infrastructure projects, weapon sales, and diplomatic partnerships designed to create a multipolar world where U.S. dominance isn't automatic. Trump just showed them that all those investments and relationships mean nothing when Washington decides to act militarily. As the leader of U.S. adversaries, China faces the most strategic damage. Andy Mock, senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, warned that if future U.S. administrations revive Monroe Doctrine-style policy, treating Latin America as exclusive American sphere, it could drastically increase tensions with China, since the region is a pillar of China's Global South strategy. Beijing spent 2 decades carefully cultivating relationships across Latin America, offering an alternative to U.S.-dominated financial institutions and creating economic partnerships that don't require countries to choose between Washington and Beijing. But here's where things started to go seriously wrong from China's perspective. Trump's operation came less than 10 hours after Maduro met with Chinese President Xi Jinping's special envoy at the presidential palace in Caracas. That timing was deliberate humiliation. The U.S. captured Venezuela's president while Chinese diplomats were still in the country, sending an unmistakable message that China cannot protect even its closest Latin American partners from American military action. According to analysts, the timing was calculated to demonstrate diminishing Chinese geopolitical influence in Latin America, Washington's backyard, and to sever Beijing's connection with the Venezuelan government network. This was the moment China's leadership began sweating. Beijing values its reputation as a reliable partner that doesn't abandon allies. Its narrative that America is a declining hegemon that can't dictate terms globally, and its strategic positioning as defender of sovereignty and opponent of interventionism. Trump just undermined all three pillars simultaneously. China couldn't stop the operation, couldn't rescue Maduro, and now looks weak to other developing nations, wondering if Chinese partnerships provide any real security against U.S. pressure. The loss of Venezuelan oil access compounds China's problems. Those 600,000 barrels per day aren't easily replaced, especially since Venezuela's heavy crude is particularly suited for certain Chinese refineries. More strategically, Venezuela represented an insurance policy for China's energy security, a major supplier, not located in a US-controlled region. Trump just seized control of that insurance policy and demonstrated that Chinese investments in alternative energy supply chains can be disrupted whenever Washington decides. Beijing is now calculating whether its other Latin American partners, particularly in Ecuador, Brazil, and Argentina, are equally vulnerable to US military or economic coercion. Now, this leaves China in an impossible bind. On one side, Beijing really needs to demonstrate that it can respond forcefully to defend its interests and protect partners. Otherwise, other countries will conclude Chinese partnerships aren't worth the risk of antagonizing Washington. That means some kind of retaliation is necessary just to maintain credibility. On the flip side, China actually has very limited options for meaningful military response in the Western Hemisphere. As analyst Sean Ryan pointed out to Al Jazeera, China doesn't have the military power to project force in Latin America. Beijing only has 2 military bases outside China, compared to America's 800 worldwide. Historically, China has not been a military intervener the way Russia and the United States are, so China is constrained to diplomatic protests, economic pressure, and working with other Latin American and Caribbean countries to build international opposition. The tricky part is that purely diplomatic responses make China look weak, while economic retaliation against the United States risks triggering a broader trade war that could damage China's own economy. So Beijing is caught between needing to respond forcefully enough to deter future US actions against Chinese partners, but not so aggressively that it provokes Trump into further escalation or economic retaliation. Russia faces similar constraints but has historically been more willing to take military risks in response to perceived US provocations. Moscow deployed nuclear-capable warships to Cuba in 2024, sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in 2018, and has consistently used ostentatious military displays in the Western Hemisphere as retaliation for US actions Russia opposes. The question now is whether Russia will escalate from symbolic military deployments to actual material support for Venezuelan resistance, or to more aggressive posturing that raises risks of direct US-Russia confrontation. Defense analysts are warning that China, Iran, and Russia could employ the same strategy they successfully used to supporting the Houthis in the Red Sea. That campaign involved providing targeting data from Chinese satellites, supplying weapons through Russian arms dealers, and leveraging Iranian drone technology to create sustained maritime harassment of commercial shipping applied to the Caribbean. This strategy would involve arming whatever resistance emerges in Venezuela, providing surveillance technology and targeting data, and using the existing drug trafficking infrastructure to deliver weapons and create asymmetric threats to U.S. naval dominance. The infrastructure is already in place. Venezuelan military officials run the Cartel de los Soles, uniformed officers who provide logistical support to Tren de Aragua and the Sinaloa cartel's trafficking operations. Those networks have submarines, modified boats, and aircraft optimized for evading detection and transporting contraband. If China and Russia start funneling anti-ship missiles, drones, or other advanced weapons through those channels, the U.S. Navy suddenly faces sophisticated asymmetric threats throughout the Caribbean. Makeshift submarines that currently transport drugs could just as easily launch missiles and deliver explosive payloads to U.S. vessels. It's complete chaos developing in slow motion. And that's exactly what Trump creates when he launches military operations without considering second and third order consequences. He focuses on the immediate objective, capturing Maduro, seizing Venezuelan oil, but completely ignores how. Adversary powers will respond strategically to change the regional security environment. This whole scenario is causing massive anxiety among U.S. military planners and intelligence analysts. The Joint Chiefs of Staff understand that provoking coordinated pushback from China and Russia and Iran in America's backyard creates risks we haven't faced since the Cold War. If these powers start arming insurgents, providing sophisticated weapons systems, or increasing their own military presence in Latin America and the Caribbean, the United States suddenly needs to dedicate far more military resources to hemisphere defense instead of focusing on Pacific and European theaters. Things became even more alarming when multiple adversary powers explicitly warned that Trump's Venezuela precedent applies globally. Iranian officials noted that if the United States can invade Venezuela to remove a leader it doesn't like, Washington could do the same to Iran. North Korea's statement emphasized that this confirms America's rogue and brutal nature, language that suggests Pyongyang sees itself as potentially vulnerable to similar action. Even Cuba's leadership explicitly warned they could be next, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio making clear his desire to see the Cuban government overthrown. The strategic message Trump inadvertently sent is catastrophic from a stability perspective. He demonstrated that international law doesn't constrain U.S. military action, that having nuclear weapons from China and Russia as partners doesn't protect you from American invasion, and that no amount of diplomatic protection prevents the United States from doing whatever it wants in the Western Hemisphere. That precedent doesn't make adversaries back down, it makes them more aggressive and more willing to take risks, because they now believe restraint gains them nothing and American intentions are fundamentally revisionist. So let's break down what this means for American security and global stability, because it's not just about Venezuela. It has serious consequences for how China, Russia, and Iran will behave toward U.S. interests worldwide. First up is the Taiwan precedent problem. Multiple analysts have warned that Beijing may draw dangerous conclusions from Trump's Venezuela operation. If the United States can blockade a country, launch military strikes, decapitate its leadership, and establish military occupation, China might conclude those same tactics are now legitimate options for dealing with Taiwan. Trump inadvertently provided Beijing with rhetorical justification for using force against Taiwan by demonstrating that great powers can ignore international law when they have overwhelming military superiority. That's an existential threat to U.S. interests in Asia and to global stability. The Middle East becomes even more volatile. Iran now has concrete evidence that diplomatic agreements mean nothing if Washington decides to pursue regime change militarily. Tehran will likely accelerate nuclear weapons development, reasoning that only nuclear capability provides real deterrence against American intervention. Iran may also increase support for proxy forces throughout the region, arm resistance movements more aggressively, and take greater risks in confrontations with U.S. forces because restraint clearly doesn't protect against American military action. Now, let's touch on what this means for Latin American alignment and Chinese influence. The UN Security Council is convening at the request of Colombia, backed by Russia and China, to condemn U.S. actions in Venezuela. Brazil's President Lula said Trump crossed an unacceptable line and that the operation sets an extremely dangerous precedent. Colombia, Mexico, and Chile all issued strong condemnations. These aren't traditional U.S. adversaries. These are democratic governments throughout Latin America who view Trump's operation as threatening regional stability and violating sovereignty norms. This Latin American backlash creates a massive opening for China to expand influence. Beijing is positioning itself as defender of sovereignty and respect for international law against U.S. interventionism. Countries throughout the region now face a choice: align more closely with Washington and risk becoming targets if their policies displease future U.S. administrations, or cultivate deeper partnerships with China that provide economic benefits without military threats. Trump just made the Chinese option look much more attractive to governments worried about maintaining independence. The economic leverage China gains is significant. Beijing has published its first new policy paper on Latin America and the Caribbean in nearly a decade, signaling renewed focus on the region, precisely as Trump demonstrates American unreliability. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told his Venezuelan counterpart that Beijing opposes unilateral bullying and that Venezuela has the right to develop mutually beneficial cooperation with other countries. That message resonates throughout Latin America with governments watching Trump's Venezuela operation. This situation shines a spotlight on the fundamental miscalculation underlying Trump's entire approach. At the heart of the issue is whether unilateral American military dominance actually strengthens U.S. security, or whether it provokes adversary coalitions that create more threats than they eliminate. Trump assumes that demonstrating overwhelming force will deter opposition and make adversaries more compliant. The actual result is that China, Russia, and Iran are coordinating more closely, sharing technology and intelligence to develop asymmetric capabilities, and working together to undermine U.S. influence globally. The precedent Trump set makes future conflicts more likely, not less. If authoritarian powers conclude that international law is meaningless and great powers can do whatever military force allows, that increases the likelihood of Chinese military action against Taiwan, Russian escalation in Ukraine or Eastern Europe, and Iranian aggression throughout the Middle East. Every adversary now has Trump's Venezuela operation as justification for their own violations of sovereignty and international norms. If Trump's precedent becomes the new normal, then we're basically saying might makes right. International law is dead, and the post-World War II order, based on sovereignty and territorial integrity, no longer exists. That would mean we're stepping into a world of constant great power military competition, where nuclear-armed nations feel entitled to invade neighbors, and no international institutions constrain their behavior. Looking ahead to how this plays out, it's clear that China and Russia won't respond immediately with dramatic military escalation. They'll pursue a long-term strategy of making Venezuela ungovernable, arming resistance movements, creating security headaches throughout the region, and demonstrating that American occupation is unsustainable. Beijing and Moscow have decades of experience supporting insurgencies, providing weapon systems through proxies, and using asymmetric warfare to bleed great powers in occupations they can't win. The Caribbean could become the next major theater of great power competition. Russian warships will increase deployments, Chinese surveillance infrastructure will expand throughout the region, and Iranian weapons technology will flow to groups opposing U.S. presence. The United States will face growing security costs, increasing military commitments, and sustained pressure from adversaries who have far more at stake in showing that American interventionism fails than Trump has in making the occupation succeed. The polling data on American public support is also concerning for sustained operations. Most Americans didn't want military involvement in Venezuela in the first place, and support drops dramatically when operations drag on, costs mount, and casualties occur. Trump sold this as a quick, decisive action, but if China and Russia successfully turn it into a prolonged insurgency, public opinion will turn sharply against continuing the occupation. That creates political vulnerability that's adversaries will exploit, understanding that time works in their favor. Right now, Trump isn't offering any strategy for how to prevent China, Russia, and Iran from undermining the Venezuela operation. He's offering military occupation with no plan for countering adversary responses, empty threats that haven't deterred Beijing or Moscow, and assumptions that American power alone solves all problems. That's not a strategy. That's hope that adversaries just accept defeat, and hope is not a plan. So, here's the deal. Trump captured Maduro thinking it would demonstrate American strength and deter adversaries. This isn't just a tactical military success with diplomatic complications. It's a strategic disaster that has unified China, Russia, and Iran in opposition, created a precedent that threatens global stability, opened massive opportunities for Chinese influence in Latin America, and set up conditions for sustained asymmetric warfare that could make Venezuela another Afghanistan. If adversaries succeed in making the Venezuela occupation costly and unsustainable, then we're basically saying that overwhelming U.S. military power can win battles but not achieve strategic objectives, that interventionism creates more problems than it solves, and that Trump's approach to foreign policy makes America less safe, not more. That would mean we've entered an era where American military dominance can translate into positive outcomes because adversaries have figured out how to impose costs that exceed any benefits. It's about so much more than just Venezuela. It's about whether unilateral American military action strengthens U.S. security or provokes adversary coalitions that create more dangerous threats, whether international order based on law survives or whether we transition to a world of constant great power conflict, and whether Trump's Venezuela gambit becomes a cautionary tale about the limits of military power or the beginning of sustained great power competition throughout the Western Hemisphere. So keep an eye on this. China is preparing economic retaliation. Russia is positioning military assets. Iran is watching for opportunities to arm resistance. The UN Security Council meets Monday. Latin American opposition is building. This is just the beginning. The geopolitical stakes have never been higher, the risks of escalation clearer, and the potential for catastrophic miscalculation as more dangerous. We're watching in real time as Trump's Venezuela operation triggers responses from nuclear-armed adversaries that could reshape global security from decades. What happens next will determine whether American interventionism succeeds or whether it provokes the exact adversary coordination and regional instability that makes the United States less secure